Hello, everyone. This is my book review of The Black Swan by Nassim Taleb. I already mentioned how much I love this author, and what this topic of the book is really about is how there's a lot of unforeseen events that have very low, quote unquote, low probabilities, would have very large impacts. And the problem that we as a society become extremely susceptible to these because we think that we can predict them, we think that their magnitude is limited, and we think that our risk models account for them, but in reality they don't, and they catch us off blindsided, and they can have really large negative consequences. So I'm gonna be going over some of the notes I took and some of the big things I took away, and I felt like this book overall was extremely helpful. I also felt like it's good to read it in conjunction with Nassim's other book, Anti-Fragile. I think they're both very useful for thinking about how to invest as well as how to approach periods or situations of uncertainty. Okay, so some kind of realization I came from is that so much of our history books are wrong because they're written retrospectively, and they're oftentimes painting everything in a lens of cause and effect, when in reality at the time they were actually experienced, they were experienced as a string of unpredictable events that were unseen by anyone, right? So it can make the idea of history seem so cookie cutter clean, but the truth of the matter is it wasn't actually that easy to kind of foresee that in the moment. Okay, so in this kind of turkey example, right, the very famous turkey example where it's like a butcher feeds a turkey for, let's say, a year, and because of that, the turkey thinks, oh, the butcher must love me because it's been feeding me. But then the next day, before Thanksgiving, the butcher kills the turkey, and then it's going to end up on the Thanksgiving table, right? So the problem with that is that the turkey was using past evidence to say, oh, this is because I'm being fed and taken care of, this must mean that they love me, and that they're not going to harm me. But the reality is that was a black swan kind of thing. But the important thing is it's not a black swan for the butcher because the butcher has different information. They know it's going to happen. Okay, so having extensive evidence of no harm being done from the butcher to the turkey cannot be used to come to the conclusion that the butcher will not hurt or kill the turkey. So it just means we have a bunch of evidence where the butcher doesn't hurt the turkey. We need to recognize in this situation we are lacking information about the opposite outcome, and just because we have a black hole of information about the butcher hurting the turkey, or the fact that we don't have any evidence of that yet, doesn't mean we can assume that the butcher will not hurt the turkey. If we had evidence about both sides, we could more successfully come to some sort of conclusion. Although it might not be entirely accurate, it would be much more accurate than assuming the butcher will never hurt the turkey. It is only through observing many black swan events of the same kind that we can extrapolate and then begin to collect data. If you had data suggesting that all turkeys got butchered around the same time per year, you could extrapolate and figure out information that only the butcher knows, which means that there's something going on, right, called Thanksgiving, where everyone's eating turkey for dinner around this time of year. In my personal opinion, the only situations where we have repeated black swans of similar types are economic bubbles. Note that in reality, there's not enough certainty or good information to deterministically call the outcome of a bubble. But by looking at stuff more carefully, you can at least realize that there will be some issues and that we're acting very blind to those issues currently. Unfortunately, that is typically the best you can do. And this is really why you still have a lot of uncertainty. Even if, you were able to predict a bubble, you wouldn't be able to predict exactly what day it would pop on, right? It's more like a range. It's more like a general kind of intuition that things are going to go the opposite direction. And that's kind of a representation of the black swan of how you can't have such certainty to such an nth degree of exactly what time the bubble is going to pop. Okay, so it is easier to find out what information or stuff is wrong than it is to find out what is right. So it is better to backtrack from what is most definitely wrong and then cautiously and slowly approach a circle to which you are certain the truth may lie there somewhere. However, you must realize that the truth is not something you can hold in your hand and narrow down. It is everything because it is both sides of the argument combined in a unique way that you must try to understand. So I think a good analogy is imagine you're kind of you have vision, you can see, but you can only see in one direction. And the truth is behind you, but you can't see in that direction. You don't have a mirror. So you have to walk backwards, but as you pass things, these are not true. And therefore, you can get closer and closer to the truth, but you'll never be able to turn around and grab it and say, oh, this is the truth. This is exactly what's going to happen. But by doing the inverse and by counting or kind of counting out all the things that are wrong, right, or not true, you can get much closer to a kind of useful approximation of the truth, which is important because we will never have that level of information to accurately predict everything. So we need to understand that we have a little bit of wiggle room and that we might be wrong. We need to learn to just sit with information and not constantly try to explain it or assign a cause to it, because oftentimes our causal painting of the facts are just plain wrong. And they're just stories we like to tell ourselves, but they can confuse us. Important thing to remember is that every time we access a memory and we kind of remember something, we change it slightly in some way without realizing it. So this just highlights how, flexible and how unknown things are, because if you think about it, if our memories are not even fully correct, right? A lot of our personality can be based off of our memories and things, and that's our life story there, right? So it just highlights there's a lot more uncertainty in different areas you don't typically expect it to be. Okay, keeping a journal can help us because it's forcing us to create stories and explanations about why things happen in our life, and then these explanations help us feel better even if they're not true. So I've realized that personally, when you start opening your eyes to the reality of how the world works, and sometimes it feels like I've opened my eyes a little too much, right? You end up with a quote hard pill to swallow, right? And this is the idea that it's hard to accept the truth, right? But the problem I've found is that this hard pill, right, is then followed by a subsequent larger and larger and larger harder pills to swallow as you get dragged in the search for truth. And you just end up with a line of infinitely long pills that get larger and larger, but curiosity pushes you forward anyway to swallow them. I think it's like a lot of people compare it to The Matrix. It's this movie where there's this one scene where you have to take a red pill to wake up or see the truth, or there's like a blue pill and you can just forget everything that happened, right? Well, the thing is, they don't mention that there should be another red pill waiting behind that first red pill that you take, and that you will face endless red pills as you keep waking up to more and more information about how the world works as you start questioning things. It really is like a rabbit hole that just never ends, and the important thing, though, is through that process of questioning and being curious and trying to find, it's a search for an objective truth that doesn't exist, but it is that pursuit of truth that then opens your eyes and gives you insight into how things actually work. And even through understanding that you don't understand stuff, that's more useful than actually having a tangible, let's say, takeaway. Okay, so the reality of the black swan problem is that some black swans are over-discussed and over-focused on in our day-to-day, when there are many others which go completely unnoticed until it's far too late. The black swans that are over-discussed are those that are easy to imagine, easy to mentally picture. The whole idea of the saying the black swan came from the idea that most swans are all white, and then once you see a black swan, that invalidates the idea that all swans have to be white. One example of this kind of easy to mentally picture thing is maybe something like, an airplane crash. Oh my gosh, it's so huge, so many people die, right? But like a car crash, right? That's not going to put that on the news because it happens all the time, even though that's actually much more dangerous for us individually than something larger, just because it's more probable that we get into a car crash, not an airplane crash. Okay, the reason why people don't intentionally chase black swan results is because they are not consistent and stable. So black swan results are kind of when you're working, all of a sudden you get a positive black swan, which is like the success just kind of takes off, As humans, we are hardwired to want consistent rewards, and this is why society shuns people who seem to be doing something but getting no reward for it for a long time. Since society is set up in this way, only those who truly want to do something just because they want to will make it, because typically the rewards won't come in time to justify the action. Imagine if you worked for 10 years straight and saw no results, then made $10 million. You are technically more successful than people making $100,000 a year, but it doesn't feel that way, and you're not treated that way during those 10 years leading up. Then after that, who knows, maybe you go on again for another 10 years without any money, then make another $10 million. This means that doing such work is both not societally rewarding and it is not personally rewarding either, because the happiness of the goal is so short compared to the immense time and dedication spent in that built-up period, right? The build-up period to that success. And so that's really why you have to do things out of passion, because otherwise you're just not going to survive and not even reach that point. And then imagine if you work 9 years and give up the last year and you don't make that 10 million, right? That is truly like kind of a tragedy, and it would be, kind of sad for sure. Okay, so Nassim makes an argument that because of this kind of black swan approach and just like how we remember stuff, we should try to lump all our unhappiness in one period of time and then spread our happiness in smaller parts over time to live a more happy than unhappy life. So we tend to not be able to remember the middle parts of certain things, right? You remember the beginning and the end. That's about it. So it's like, well, if you don't really remember the duration of something, then having a long period of unhappiness will in your memory just be logged as, oh, we were pretty unhappy during this time. But if you have a long period of happiness, that will also just be like, oh, we were just pretty happy during this time. But you need to spread out the happiness so you kind of feel that recurrent like bursts of separate, distinct happy events. Okay, history is any succession of events that is viewed with the lens of hindsight bias, which is then used to present a causal relationship through a form of a narrative, which is likely incorrect in that it is a severe and debilitating oversimplification of the truth. Silent evidence, which is evidence that is not considered because it is unable to be considered. For example, testimonies of dead people who experienced an event, so you aren't just relying on whoever survived the event to recount what happened. Silent evidence is what events use to conceal their own randomness. It's like the lack of knowledge, and it's just a black hole. And there's a lot of stuff in there, and we just like to ignore the black hole, and then there's all sorts of problems that we get from it. The news and media always want to present a causally linked story that is most often plain wrong. This highlights the corruptive effects of listening to the news all the time and how you have to carefully control your inputs. Also, just like from getting too much information, right? You're going to start being like, oh, I need to make sense of this information. I need to make it into a narrative. But that narrative could just be completely fake. It is not good to expect too much from reading success stories because they are often unable to capture the full picture and the full reality of the situation. Because we live in a world with extreme winner-take-all effects, we must realize that we suffer in every situation from survivorship bias. We only hear from those who became successful, not the people who didn't. When you have imperfect information, randomly guessing and predicting become the same thing. People who predict just don't recognize the imperfections in their information and assume they are doing better than randomly guessing, which they often are not. The reason why learning more knowledge can hurt you is because the more information that you are given, the more hypotheses you will create, and the worse off you will be because you will see more random noise and mistake it for useful information. This ties back to the signal-to-noise ratio discussed in his other book, Anti-Fragile, and the idea is that if you take in less information, you'll have more meaningful outcomes from that information. Okay, so this is kind of my take on things, my opinion here. Being a quote-unquote low IQ caveman. So this is a term you could say for like somebody who, doesn't really understand anything. Like maybe for the stock market, they're just like, oh, stocks always go up, and then they just buy. And because they never sell, maybe they actually make a lot of money, right? But like they have zero understanding of stuff, right? Okay, so being a low IQ caveman for certain things is actually very beneficial. When super knowledgeable people try to predict the future, they are often wrong and very wrong, and the bigger problem is that they can't recognize that they may not know everything and could be wrong. If you recognize you aren't smart, you'll be more realistic, hopefully, about not knowing everything, and have greater humility in looking for reasons why you could be wrong, or at least being open-minded to those things, which will protect you. So it's kind of like, if you're a janitor, you understand that like you don't know anything about like, Wall Street stuff. Like you don't know stuff about super complex. You understand that, right? But the problem is, it's like if you're on Wall Street, you think that you know everything, but the reality is you probably don't even know anything. So it's just your ego getting in the way and all of a sudden like complicating your decision-making process and kind of clouding your thinking. I wanted to sum it up kind of in a saying like this: a little knowledge goes a long way. A lot of knowledge goes shorter than you think it does and actually goes against you eventually. Okay, another thing I learned from this book is if you expect to finish something in a short amount of time and it is taking longer, expect it to drag out even longer, not expecting it to be finished faster, right? So oftentimes it's like, oh, this is overdue, right? This project should be finished faster because we're already overdue. Well, because it's already overdue, you should actually expect it to take even longer to finish. This is because the reasons causing you to overshoot beyond your deadline this far out will not disappear, and instead may actually compound to cause you to overshoot past your deadline even further. That happens a lot with, trying to write a textbook or something like that. That was the example he used. He said they overestimated severely, and this is also why you see so many building projects go over budget and way out of the time frame that they should be finished by. Okay, so the problem with prediction into the future or predicting things into the future is that our error rate grows exponentially as we add conditions or complexities to the point that we have to be so accurate and have so much knowledge of everything to the level of which that, amount of knowledge is impossible. And this makes it truly impossible to predict things with precision, and once again leading us to need to acknowledge our error rate and uncertainty. There's one example of a weather forecasting for figuring out if there's a hurricane coming. And then the scientist kept getting wrong numbers, and he was so confused, and then he realized that there was a rounding error that was throwing everything off. And the rounding error was so specific, it could have been, the wind movement generated by a butterfly. And that could have affected the model. So this just shows how precarious all of our predicting tools typically are, and that we are really oversimplifying stuff. And because of that, if you have a slight change in, if I'm off by just a little bit, it's going to ripple effect throughout the model, and all of a sudden the outcome is going to be largely different than what I thought it was going to be. Black swan thinking allows you to still be certain about some stuff, but it only allows you to be certain about what is wrong and not what is right. So you must approach the truth by successive approximations, like moving backwards toward the truth without being able to see it behind you, like I mentioned. Another important caveat is that randomness is not an intrinsic property of something. It is incomplete information that you have. And the last thing I want to say is that instead of focusing extensively and exhaustively on probability and percent that you are correct, instead you should focus on what you have to gain from and what you have to lose. So you need to try to look for situations where you can gain much more than you can lose. And as long as, the probabilities aren't completely against you, you'll be most likely okay. That was my book review of Black Swan. If you have any questions, put them below. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.